There is a photograph from 1992 that Billy Crystal still has. He is being roasted at the Friars Club, sitting at the dais, and just behind him is Robin Williams, who has spent the last several minutes pretending with total commitment to be Billy Crystal's foreskin. He called himself Rumpled Foreskin. The room was screaming with laughter. Billy Crystal, telling this story decades later on a late-night couch, still cannot get through it without breaking into the kind of laugh that only exists between two people who have known each other since before either of them was famous. That is the Robin Williams that Billy Crystal carries with him, not the headline, not the tragedy that the world reduced him to in a single August afternoon in 2014. The friend who would do anything, absolutely anything, for a laugh, and who somehow made you laugh harder than you thought you could, while never once making you feel like the joke. At 78, Billy Crystal is still telling that truth in rooms full of strangers, because somebody has to keep saying who Robin actually was before the world's memory of him calcifies into just the ending. The two men met in the late 1970s on the Los Angeles comedy circuit. Two young stand-ups working the same small rooms in the years before either of them had any idea what was coming. Robin Williams had grown up about as far from struggling comic territory as a person could start. He was born July 21st, 1951, in Chicago, the son of a senior Ford executive, and the family eventually settled into a 40-room farmhouse in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, the kind of house with its own staff, the kind of childhood that looked, from any outside vantage point, charmed. He went to the private Detroit Country Day School. He was class president. His classmates remember him as warm and hilarious, the kind of kid who could make any room laugh without seeming to try. But the house was big, and his parents were busy, and Robin spent enormous stretches of his childhood essentially alone, with the family's maid as his most consistent companion. He has talked about inventing entire worlds with his toy soldiers just to have something to populate the silence. He won a scholarship to Juilliard, one of only 2 students accepted that year into the advanced program, the other being Christopher Reeve, and then walked away from it in his junior year because the stage, the immediate and electric exchange with a live room, was pulling at him harder than the formal training could hold him. He landed in the Bay Area comedy scene and then in Los Angeles. And what happened next happened fast, because there has rarely been a performer who could do what Robin Williams could do on a stage. He won a Grammy for Best Comedy Album in 1979 for Reality, What a Concept. He was cast as the alien Mork on Mork and Mindy and became, within a single television season, one of the most recognizable comedians in America. By every external measure, his career was a runaway success before he was 30. It was also underneath that success where Billy Crystal found him, at parties, at clubs, at the Friars Club roasts, where the two of them would eventually become regular fixtures, destroying each other on stage with the specific freedom that only exists between comedians who trust each other completely. Billy Crystal has talked about those years with the particular fondness reserved for the period before everything got complicated, when Robin would just show up somewhere, uninvited and unannounced, and the entire room would reorganize itself around him within about 90 seconds
because nobody could resist watching what he was going to do next. What Billy Crystal also watched, because he was there, close enough to see it, was the part that did not make it into the magazine profiles. The comedy world of the late 1970s ran on cocaine the way later decades would run on other things, and Robin Williams, who needed almost nothing external to be the most electric person in any room, fell into it completely. Friends who knew him during those years have described watching him take cocaine from strangers without even glancing at who was offering it. A fan would walk up holding a spoon, and he would simply lean in. The director of Mork and Mindy has talked about Robin arriving on set wrecked some mornings, barely functional, the wreckage of nights that started with cocaine and ended with alcohol to bring himself back down from it.
In March 1982, John Belushi died. Robin had been with him the night before, partying in the same circles that had become almost inescapable in that era of the industry. The two men were friends, and the death of someone you were with hours before he dies from the exact substances you yourself were using does something specific to a person. It stops being abstract. It becomes a mirror you cannot look away from. With his first child on the way, Robin Williams quit drinking and quit drugs decisively. The way you quit something when you have just watched it kill someone you loved. He told People magazine years later that Belushi's death scared an entire generation of people in the business straight, at least for a while. He used to wake up in the back seat of his own car, keys still in the ignition, and not understand how he had gotten there. Then he simply stopped. What replaced the addiction was, for years, cycling. He found a bike shop owner named Tony Tom and became close with him, and he told Tom directly that biking was a great deal better for him than cocaine, that it had, in his own words, saved his life. It is one of the few times Robin Williams described anything in his own life with that specific phrase, and it tells you something about how close to the edge he understood himself to have been standing. The sobriety held for 20 years, 2 decades during which Robin Williams built the body of work that defined him for an entire generation. Good Morning Vietnam in 1987 showed the world what happened when his improvisational genius was given an actual character and stakes to channel through. The radio monologues were largely his own invention, recorded in long, unscripted bursts that the editors then had to shape into something a film could hold. Dead Poets Society in 1989 showed the opposite gear entirely: restraint, stillness, a teacher whose passion for language and life had to be communicated mostly through quiet conviction rather than velocity. Aladdin gave his voice, untethered from his body for the first time, room to become something almost elemental. Animators have said they built entire sequences around audio of him riffing in the booth because what he generated in the moment was better than anything they could have scripted. Mrs. Doubtfire in 1993 turned a story about a father desperate not to lose his children into one of the most beloved comedies of the decade, built on hours of improvised material that the editors had to cut down from an almost unusable surplus of brilliance. The Birdcage in 1996 paired him with Nathan Lane in a performance of generous, loving restraint, letting his co-star have the loudest moments while he anchored the film's heart. And in 1997, Good Will Hunting
finally won him the Academy Award after 3 prior nominations. A performance built on stillness and listening. The park bench scene where he tells Matt Damon's character, "It's not your fault," becoming one of the most quoted moments in American film, delivered by a man who understood something true about pain underneath all the noise he was capable of making. He was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished entertainers of his generation, equally devastating in drama as he was uncontainable in comedy, a range that almost no other performer of his era could claim. And through all of it, Billy Crystal was there, not as a casual industry acquaintance, but as one of the people who actually knew him, who got pretended to be by him as a body part at a public roast, who could call him and have him show up, who shared the specific fraternity of stand-up comedians who started in small rooms in the 1970s and somehow ended up among the most famous people in America. They were both part of a circle that included Robin's closest friend, Christopher Reeve, from those Juilliard years, a friendship that survived Reeve's catastrophic 1995 riding accident in a way that revealed something essential about who Robin actually was underneath the noise. When Reeve woke up paralyzed and facing the possibility of choosing to end his own life rather than live in the condition he found himself in, Robin Williams showed up at the hospital dressed as a Russian doctor, doing an absurd accent, and made his oldest friend laugh for the first time since the accident. A single moment of relief that Reeve later said helped him decide to keep living. Billy Crystal carried that story the way he carried all the Robin stories, as proof of something that the public record kept missing, that the comedy was never separate from the care. It was the care, delivered in the only language Robin fully trusted.
They worked together publicly, too. They roasted each other at the Friars Club and at private gatherings, and the audiences who watched those roasts had no idea how much real affection sat underneath the savagery, because that is how comedians who genuinely love each other actually talk to one another. They aim for the most outrageous, most surgically precise insult they can find. And the audience laughs without understanding that the insult is itself a kind of love letter. Billy Crystal has also been one of the steady hosts and organizers behind Comic Relief, the benefit specials he ran for years alongside Robin Williams and Whoopi Goldberg, raising tens of millions of dollars for homelessness relief in America. That collaboration ran for over 2 decades, long stretches of real, sustained, unglamorous work between 3 performers who could have simply coasted on their fame, and instead kept showing up year after year because they believed it mattered. It is one of the quieter parts of Robin Williams' legacy, overshadowed by the films and the tragedy. And it is one of the parts Billy Crystal returns to most often when he wants people to understand the actual texture of who his friend was. In 2003, the sobriety broke. Robin was filming a movie in Alaska, isolated, and has described feeling alone and afraid in a way that he later identified with brutal clarity as the most dangerous possible state for someone with his history. He told himself it would just be a taste. Within a week, he was buying so much alcohol that he said he sounded like a wind chime walking down the street, bottles clinking in the bag.
He has talked about the specific psychology of it, that there is a voice that tells an alcoholic he can drink again. And it is the same voice, he said, that calls to you from the edge of a tall building. He went into rehab in 2006. He fell again. He went back into treatment at the Hazelden Foundation in Minnesota in 2014, just months before the end. What almost nobody understood at the time, what Robin Williams himself did not fully understand, was that the renewed drinking was not simply a relapse of the old addiction. It was the leading edge of something else entirely. In late 2013, strange and seemingly unconnected symptoms had begun arriving. Insomnia, heartburn, a slight tremor in his left hand that everyone, including his doctors, attributed to an old shoulder injury, a rising and inexplicable anxiety that didn't match anything happening in his actual life. His wife, Susan Schneider-Williams, would later write about those months in an essay that remains one of the most devastating and important documents about brain disease ever produced by someone who lived inside it. She called it "The Terrorist Inside My Husband's Brain." By the winter, things had become harder to explain away. He was experiencing paranoia, delusions, and a memory loss so severe that while filming Night at the Museum 3, he struggled to retain his own lines. A man whose entire professional life had been built on instantaneous verbal invention, suddenly unable to trust his own mind to hold a sentence. Susan has written that Robin knew, with a terrible clarity, that he was losing his mind. He kept the worst of it from almost everyone. He had spent his entire life being the person who made the room feel better. He was not going to stop now, even as the disease made that harder every single day. By the final months, there was no longer any way to hide it. He walked with a slow, shuffling gait. He had trouble finding words mid-sentence. His left hand would not stop trembling. He lost the ability to accurately judge distance and depth. Susan has described a specific symptom, a frozen, mask-like expression that would settle over his face, robbing him of even the basic mobility that had always made his expressions so alive on screen. The man whose body had been his greatest comedic instrument, whose face could shift through a dozen different characters in the space of one sentence, was losing the physical control of that instrument piece by piece. And he knew it was happening, and there was no name for what was happening to him yet. The diagnosis came after his death. Lewy body dementia, a degenerative brain disease that mimics, in its early stages, the symptoms of Parkinson's and can produce the exact constellation of paranoia, anxiety, and cognitive slippage that had been quietly dismantling him for nearly a year. Nobody around him, not his doctors, not his family, not Robin himself, had the name for it, while there was still time to explain to him what was actually happening to his brain. He thought, by every account, that he was simply losing his mind, with no medical reason and no path back. He said goodnight to Susan on the evening of August 10th, 2014. It was the last thing he ever said to her. He took his own life the following morning. He was 63 years old.
The world's grief was immediate and enormous, the kind of collective shock that attaches itself to very few public deaths. but for the people who actually knew him, for Billy Crystal, who had spent decades being publicly insulted and privately adored by this man, who had watched him invent an entire absurd persona as a body part at a roast, just to make a room scream with laughter. The grief was a different animal entirely. It was personal. It still is. What Billy Crystal has tried to do in the years since, in every interview where the subject comes up, is resist the flattening that happens to people after they die in a way the public finds shocking. He does not lead with the ending. He leads with the foreskin joke. He leads with the years of stand-up rooms and Friars Club roasts and the specific electricity of being in Robin Williams's orbit when nobody was paying for a ticket, when it was just two comedians who loved making each other laugh harder than anyone else could. He tells the story about Alan King roasting him so savagely that he had to lean over and warn the older comedian that his actual mother was sitting at table 5, and Alan King, without missing a beat, simply addressed her directly, and Billy's mother stood up and told the room not to get her started. That is the world Robin Williams lived in for 30 years before any of it ended. A world built entirely on the specific, generous cruelty of people who trusted each other enough to be merciless and meant nothing but love by it. Billy Crystal has said, in his own way, across many interviews and many stages, that the tragedy of Robin Williams is not simply that he died too young, although he did. It is that the disease took something from him before it took his life, his words, his timing, his ability to trust the instrument that had defined him since he was a lonely kid making up stories for toy soldiers in a 40-room house where nobody was paying close enough attention. And it is that he spent the final year of his life putting on, for almost everyone around him, the bravest performance of his career, convincing the world he was simply tired, simply working too hard, simply Robin being Robin, while privately terrified that his own mind was abandoning him and he didn't know why. At 78, Billy Crystal carries both versions of his friend simultaneously, because that is what it means to actually have known somebody, not the sanitized public memory, not the single image the world settled on in the aftermath, but the whole person. The man who could make 2,500 people in a ballroom howl with laughter pretending to be a body part. The man who quit drugs the morning after a friend died from them and stayed clean for 20 years through sheer force of will. The man who lost a battle that had no name yet against an enemy that nobody, not his doctors, not his wife, not Robin himself, could properly identify until it was too late to matter. Billy Crystal still tells the foreskin story and still laughs every single time, because that laugh is the truest tribute he knows how to give. That is the truth Billy Crystal has chosen to tell again and again at 78 years old. Not the headline, the friend.